In that place did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Shangri-La, you know the place. Some kind of eudaimonium, ethereum, civium, some kind of game bee, fourth frontier, integral supermind, welcoming cosmopolis. Some kind of embodied, extended, non-dualist, rural-friendly, metapolitical, Neil Stephenson-backed, eco-cosmic, trans-egalitarian, technologically ephemerized, neo-naturalist, neo-futurist, metamodern, developmentalist Dharma hive. Some peculiarly positive place for all those divinely human and fully human, full-spectrum, post-formal, trans-rational, centauric, self-authoring, self-transcendent, mutant, organic, saliently super-present, archaic, revivalist, transhuman, post-capitalist, post-cybernetic, post-postmodern, diaphanous, supra-sense-making, supra-historical, Gibbsarian black swans of tomorrow, and of the tomorrow that is always, already, also today. Amen. That place. Heaven on earth. I'm Layman Pascal, and with my usual 2020 Epimethean hindsight, I'm pretty goddamn sure all that stuff is what I meant when I coined the phrase planetary wisdom civilization. But is it? Is it still what I meant to mean, if I even knew what I meant, if you know what I mean? I mean, look, I was born, wriggling and delicately deposited from regions unknown, upstairs in a black and white farmhouse on a 17-acre piece of forest, field, and beachfront land on Kaleva Road in Sointula. Kaleva means paradise. Sointula means harmony. Gruff, idealistic, socialist Finnish mine workers gave it those names while they were trying to set up their ideal society on ultra-rural Malcolm Island off the north tip of Vancouver Island in the British kind of Columbia. They were neither the first nor the last to try it there. They were preceded by starry-eyed Christians awaiting the apocalypse who couldn't hack the farming and fishing life, and they were followed by smart, resilient, capable back-to-the-land hippies looking for the basic humanist freedoms that are apparently so anti-American you just couldn't find them in late 20th century North American cities. So at birth, I already stood in my parents' black and white gumboots on the giant shoulders of 3 utopias. Clearly none of them a perfect success, and yet my golden childhood was virtually perfect. Goddamn Godbait, and he is ravenous as always. Each wave of utopians seemed to have better understood how to live a healthy, meaningful, grounded existence in that idyllic place. Better and better utopias. That's a good story. But today, my island, my paradisical island, has a fraction of its former population. Industrial scale, international fishing, and ocean toxicity has wiped out the resource base. Most of the land bought up as investment opportunities by people who don't even live there. And despite the massive proliferation of decentralizing technologies, the people who love it most can't exist out on the frontier, and their children move en masse to cities they don't really want to live in. Cities where patting yourself on the back for sorting out paper and glass before it gets dumped in the dump anyway is considered doing your part for the environment. Cities where considering voting in unpleasant, minimally representative elections every 4 years or arguing your views on social media is considered doing your part for society. And where depressively enabling other people to get rich is considered to be a livelihood you're lucky to have. In the degree to which our pig-fucking authorities have permitted this unholy situation, they are to blame for a justifiable mass outburst of unthinking anti-authorityism. In the degree to which our insulated, maladaptive, self-serving institutions have enabled this situation, they are to blame for a well-deserved, more or less complete lack of faith in our institutions. And if our police departments are run in a way that does not make citizens aspirationally happy to behold the arrival of the coppers in almost any situation, then they are a complete failure at their one job. So how do we get this island Earth out of the apocalypse groove into the paradise track? Those two scratches on the phonograph are so close to each other we can barely tell them apart. Our fumbling fingers need to get much defter. Whither lieth that planetary cathedral of which I have often spoken? What is the road to utopian, cosmopolitan, eco-socialist, rural-friendly trans-capitalism that enfolds the culture codes of all scales and phases of history in a way that lets them cross-pollinate without sabotaging each other? How do we get to that Nietzschean dream of a civilization that is true to the earth, true to the body, and maximizes the intensity and distribution of peak experiences and flow states without tricking ourselves into seeking for them in unrealities or ill health? When will Jesus bring the pork chops? I don't know, and none of you do either. We don't even know how we personally got to be where we got to be so far. And the future results of our actions are as obvious and easy to analyze as following one stream of water into the turbulence where two rocky rivers meet on a windy day. No fucking chance. Narratives of change are told retroactively and from incentivized partial perspectives that cannot possibly track the multiple tentacles of causality through a limited notion of time, driven by unknown ratios of drives and attractors operating through largely omnidirectional and subconscious intentionalities, only partly glimpsed by the rational mind. So fuck off with your utopian propaganda. But goddammit, we probably do need a lot more utopian speculation if we're gonna paddle a leaking canoe in the frothy waters above this abyss. We both can and cannot do anything. If we're unlucky, those cancel each other out. And if we're lucky, they're two complementary wings of the same legendary bird. A phoenix, maybe. Possibly an emu. But at this point, no one would believe me if I said it was the American eagle. Listen, said Vonnegut, if I had to vet my wad on just one thing, it would be just to intensify your overall beingness. Enrich your subconscious responses. Risk yourself in relationships and projects you cannot quite explain. And immerse yourselves in rich ecological, intellectual patterns that exceed your linear capacity to comprehend them. That is probably the best single bet. But if I had to bet on two things, I'd add a straightforward systemic upgrade that hastens into place the minimum necessary so-called radical shift toward basic stabilization of economic rights, healthcare rights, and a qualitatively based ecological economy that stops bureaucratically privileging monstrously swollen mega cheaters and financialist extractors as though they were the meritorious individualist job creators we can't live without. But changing the ways of nation states and markets is a large, slow task if even possible. So if I had to bet on three things, like a pornographic Hindu trifecta, I'd also solicit visions of how society could actually work better without killing everyone prematurely. Or at least how a small handful of the right kind of people could start building the mood and principles and relationships that might blossom into a better type of society over the next few generations. What kind of better civic and human and spiritual and powerful seed civilizations might we be able to actually set up? And what kind of future draws them forward toward itself? Against my better judgment, I guess it's Shangri-La after all. Somewhere between science fiction and philosophy, and somewhere between clarifying the meta-crisis of Game A and riding out onto the fourth frontier. Somewhere between the ruin of the first tier and the birth of the second is a speculative time between worlds, a mauve bardo hinterland, where we offer the cosmos and each other a version of how things could work out, so that at least in retrospect we didn't only passively react to our atmospheric premonitions of doom and mismanagement. Inventing such loftily intermediate visions probably helped the authors of those visions to move a half step forward in the self-refining clarification of their own smarts and values, the way Socrates seemed to have said we should. But maybe those visions also will have a lot of basic moods, insights, and aspirations in common. Maybe they will all be roughly anti-fragile with meta-epistemic values, decentralized intelligence, multi-dimensional health, transformation of our collective protocols, neo-archaic, neo-futurist, neo-naturalist aesthetics and ethics, and opening up some religion that isn't even a religion, even if it takes the form of various religions. And if it weren't for the fact that Scylla and Charybdis bit off my good crossing fingers, I'd cross those fingers and hope for that shit. And because I'm pathetically attached to being one of the voices in the discourse, I guess I'll have to voice a few idiosyncratic words about Utopia myself. So where do I come into this story? A few years ago, when time still existed, I wrote a suggestively titled article entitled The 5 Pillars of Planetary Wisdom Civilization. It was among my first overeager attempts to think through the social and procedural correlates of individual maturation along multiple lines of intelligence or in multiple domains of meaning. I say correlates. The key thing that moved me to write that piece, or several versions of that piece, was my eruption of a strong feeling that individual efforts are insufficient, and so their collective correlates must be sought out, even if that be with a grimy fool's lantern. It could be said that I have been a devoted spiritual student and even teacher, and that holds a pride of place in my life, if not a place of pride. But it seemed obvious even to me that if we could Baha'i our way to an enlightened world by the periodic industrial scale efforts of individual enlightened avatars, great and groovy teachers, mega messiahs, hardworking loyal lineage holders, and other nimbus-laden spiritual mutants who encode their teaching and cultural artifacts and personally train a handful of adept successors and inspire a passionate symbolic faith in large groups of believers, then by God we would already have such an illuminated world. For that blessed event has happened many times in world history. Buddhas keep coming and they keep not being enough, except for the individual spiritual welfare of a lucky few weirdos. What we need is not a society filled with adepts, but a society structured in such a way that it supports the flourishing of adepts, structured in such a way that it is analogous to what goes on inside adepts. All the proposals we can make about the necessary conditions for a thriving civilization, or even just one that doesn't drop the bacteriological nukes on itself too many times, are speculative and downstream from generating a smarter, wiser, healthy system that correlates to smarter, wiser, healthier individuals. The political solution, therefore, is not to do what the most balanced, clever, or luminous people think we should do, but to set up group decision-making processes and minimum supportive conditions that can grow a system toward an equivalent degree of balance and brilliance on its own terms. And you'd better gird your loins, because this may involve processes that seem quite alien to the ways of life and values normally associated with human flourishing and depth development. We cannot live in one great commune any more than we can live in the mystic medievalism of the Himalayan Buddhas, or even the endlessly self-sabotaging and disingenuous incrementalism of modern liberal institutions. If the future of this blue-green soccer ball in near space turns out well at all, it will be because of processes that Nazis, moderates, and hippies all feel highly dubious, risky, and unnatural in the extreme. Let me give you a for instance. People who achieve high levels of meaning, self-actualization, well-being, and self-transcendence are typically those who understand that many of the most valuable things in life are not quantified or monetized. That is a pedantically standard observation from people who regularly experience the deep worthwhileness and presence of the world. However, that might not tell us a single goddamn thing about how to improve a society and its economy, because those systems may require us to quantify and monetize anything in order for the system to take it seriously enough to adapt into its patterns. So, just for fun, let's lick a mind toad and imagine a fabled sci-fi future world in which our economy gets its numbers very differently. The simplest way into this line of thinking is probably through the forest and into the field of ecological economics. An ecological economist might say, look, son, put down that coffee and semen-stained dog-eared copy of the Wall Street Journal and consider where your so-called numbers are coming from. Right now, you have this fantastical notion of a quantitatively infinite growth possibility, based on increasingly abstract versions of negotiated pricing on goods, services, and ideas. Or, let's be honest, on bets, bets on bets, and bets that bets will fail, etc. and ad nauseum. Right now, the numbers that determine the capitalist game are established by a negotiation between something like so-called supply and demand. Right now, a dollar is negotiated abstraction that represents something my chickens and your cow and the fractional ownership of Bob's intellectual new album might have in common. It is ideally a kind of balance point between different sets of exchanges, and it fluctuates based on variations in how easy it is to get something and how desperate people are to get that thing, because of their guesses about how exchangeable that thing might be in the next quarter. These are the negotiation numbers. So, I find a handsome conifer tree and cut it down and cut it up. And you really need some wood, so I sell it to you for 100 of money. You get the wood and I get 100 social credits. That's where the numbers came from, and we can compete to get more of these numbers based on an agreement that they give us an increased share over social resource distribution. But that presupposes the tree has a value of 0 money before being cut down. That's where the ecological economist comes in. She says, look, there are a finite number of actual resources, and they mutually establish their value as the total biomaterial substructure of survival and meaning on this planet. If we run out, then the entire economy and world crashes. If these resources are not counted in our credits, then we will pursue credits at the expense of our resources. But we could decide to count resources as credits. What if we calculated that stupid lurking tree is doing 500 of money's worth of work by standing guard in the forest, housing little birds and mites, holding the soil together, producing oxygen, keeping cellulose on standby, feeding subterranean mycelial superbrains. Now you cut it down and sell it for the same 100 of money, and you are 400 monies down on the deal. You are a loser in the same game. In the exact same market competition, you are now incentivized to gain by not cutting down the tree, just because we are getting the numbers differently. So let's say we thought of negotiated numbers and resource numbers as being something like the upper and lower right quadrants on a Wilbur-style interval graph. Then we could ask ourselves what the other zones might be and how they might contribute numbers. Why is subjective value not quantified? satisfied? Why isn't something literally more valuable in terms of social credits if it provides more health, meaning, and pleasure to individuals? What about intersubjectivity? Scads of folks, a whole blathering bunch of them, have speculated that social network likes to be treated as if they were currency. You might need to tweak them, standardize them, give people a limited number subtracted from you whenever you give one out. And you'd have to try to figure out who actually counts as a peer in which contexts. But there's no reason in principle you couldn't get money numbers from mutual and personal domains, in addition to market negotiation and life world resources. I have jokingly called this the tetrabus. There are lots of different ways to approach this problem, and it would be abstract and tricky. But the negotiation numbers of the current economy are already abstract and tricky. Imperfection and complication is not an impediment to economic change. Now, the point of this thought experiment is to imagine a utopian situation in which every time anyone gains $1, there has been value added not only to the normal market, but also to the ecology and shared feeling space and individual well-being. If that was the case, then almost every moral and spiritual argument against the market would vanish. It might be a fuzzy concept, but take a minute to imagine what it would be like if every non-monetary thing was also monetarily valued. It is the basic idea of crediting parents for work of raising a child or keeping a home. Why does the fluctuating abstract number of social credits not change when you have a peak experience, or a deep, beautiful connection with someone, or when you plant a garden or pick some trash off the side of the road? Why does it save you money rather than cost you money to dump poison into the ocean? We're getting our numbers the wrong way. Why do you think there's so much pushback against something so simplistic as carbon credits? It's one step towards counting the ecosystem as if it were money, which would radically change things if we took several more shuffling and tentative steps in that speculative direction. Let this idea be a reminder that any experiment in new living has got to get beyond the ideas of no money and the idea of using the same old clams as the rest of this dark civilization. You've got to try to do money better in multiple ways simultaneously. Not just the same numbers verified by blockchain banking, but a real goddamn rethink on the sources of the numbers themselves. We need to be experimenting with that. This is a seed idea. Maybe it grows, maybe it dies, but it means you'll have to rethink the origins of the quantities that drive the economy of quantity calculation in any superior civilization system or small-scale experiment towards it. Let's call this system Kaleva, the paradise in which I imagine that I grew up. In this sci-fi future turtle-riding super city world of Kaleva, our shining council of alien elders, in consultation with their quantum AI allies, have instituted those things I once called the 5 pillars. I called them Cult, MIP, Civ, Cospals, Smart Groups, and the New Academy. That's a culture of cultivation, a massive internal profiling civilization. Alliances between cultural operating systems, smarter collective intelligence protocols, and new kinds of educational institutions, regardless of whether we try to do this as nation-states or as emergent new city-type enclaves. But cult could be the most important of them all, if most important is the same as the most fun to say. And I'd fight any local man who says different. I might even fight a bride. Cult, I said. I mean, if you're going to have a qualitatively better civilization, then you need to incentivize real open-ended self-development as part of the basic social contract. That principle by which citizens are morally entitled to the minimum economic safety, health, and free expression rights. Universal programs and guarantees of various kinds are essential, not only because we need them to cultivate a we spirit, but also because they are at the heart of depressurizing, resecuring, and strengthening people in preparation for the already existing, still accumulating, and inevitably surprising disruptions and temptations to business as usual. But what does the citizen owe in exchange for these freedoms? What kind of collective culture emerges from the shared responsibility of free citizens? It is not enough tomorrow and the day after tomorrow to just receive and maintain our current habits. No one is neutral on a moving train. You are not beautiful and worthwhile merely because you exist, no matter what Oprah says. You are beautiful and worthwhile because you participate in the general attempt to enrich, improve, and deepen the most meaningful and empowering things, appropriately to your character, capacity, and circumstances, of course. If you are not trying to improve your muscle tone regularly, then your muscles are degenerating. That is God's natural law. You do not merely have the right to pursue happiness, you have the goddamned obligation to pursue real happiness, which means you have to work at improving your quality of experience in all the mansions of your Father's divine house. Kaleva then is full of conservative progressives. If you want your UBI check, you'd better be prepared to drink a glass of clean water and spend 20 minutes in the brain machine. And the more the robots take over blue and white-collar jobs alike, the less people are required to maintain the system. So the more they are required to deepen and qualitatively enhance the system. That's your end of the social contract. And it can happen in 1,000 ways at 1,000 speeds, but it's got to happen so that developmental civilization becomes the shared moral clarity and self-definition of the ethos. And you know what's almost as fun to say as cult is MIPSIV. What the hell is a MIPSIV? Well, Barack Hussein Obama, that notorious conservative champion of multi-ethnic oligarchy, said at the funeral of John Lewis that the dead man was headed for, and I quote, that blessed destination where we are judged by the content of our character. That is partly the imagined judgment of the soul in heaven, but also the heaven-like fulfillment of Martin Luther King's dream city, where we are not judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our characters, where we are not, so to speak, externally profiled, but we are internally profiled. But how to do that? What would it really mean to more successfully judge people by the content of their character? Which variables would have to be taken into account, and by what network of diabolical devices could this be accomplished in a way that makes us collectively more secure, sovereign, autonomous, efficient, and free? We certainly do not want to be pigeonholed like filthy pigeons in stinking profile boxes based on our genitals or skin pigment or names or headgear or a word we used once in a social media post or the knee-jerk public association of some website we visited with a particular political group that the authorities are so weak that they fear to hear from. Their fear is justified by their knowledge of the deep insufficiency and instability of the con game they are running. Our fear is justified by millennia of observations that the controllers will try to control us unintelligently for their own temporary benefit once they have analyzed us into simple categories. That is the truth. But so is the fact that we need to organize our lives based on our real traits and treat others according to their real traits, rather than their claims or costumes or sexuality or affiliations or the objects they happen to possess. we need to know our real traits. We need to use those traits to organize society and our own lives so that people are more likely to be where they want to be and can do best. In the classical fantasy of spiritual culture, we are all spontaneously organized faithfully around benevolent people, dripping with genuine wisdom and beingness. And if you gain the capacity in detecting something like wisdom in other people, my hat goes off to you. This may be an excellent way to organize your personal life, but it doesn't help us much on the disorienting scale of planetary society. We don't need a few good apples. We need a scheme for making good and bad apples and oranges have collectively good outcomes. We lie to ourselves when we say our elections represent the will of the people, or that the invisible hand of the collective selfishness of the market produces benevolent outcomes. But we are intuiting the very real possibility that some kind of voting system could represent the will of the people, and some kind of market could turn individual immorality into collective morality. Social development does not depend on the presence of wise people in the current system, nor does it depend on the kinds of systems proposed by the wise. Jesus knew the moneylenders were a problem, but Jesus doesn't know how to regulate the banks. Social development toward Kaleva depends on systems that are supportive of the conditions under which wisdom tends to flourish, and systems that are analogous to those processes that occur in the individual cultivation of wisdom. So put that into your smoke and pipe it, goddammit. Just like a poorly organized mob of smart people can behave stupidly, a well-organized group of the foolish can be wise. And we don't want a foolish arrangement of the wise. We need a wise arrangement of fools whose chances of becoming wiser are significantly increased. That means we need a huge increase in collective systemic self-awareness, self-management, nuance, subtlety, integrated plurality, abundant health, ongoing development, and depth. And part of that is that we have to know and take seriously the real traits of our fellow human beings and know what our fellow citizens are actually like. When Masters, Johnson, and Kinsey published their findings in the 1950s, it gave enormous impetus to Wilhelm Reich's sexual revolution, because America could suddenly inspect what was actually going on in the bedrooms of Americans. The deceptive social simplification that held our habits of disempowering discrimination in place started to waver. It's one thing to make a war on pornography and cannabis if you imagine it's being used only by a few insurgent perverts and ne'er-do-wells. But it's another thing entirely when you discover this behavior belongs to 90% of the decent population. There are huge social shifts that start to unfold only when we gain richness in shared self-awareness about the individual character of our fellows. Arguably, authoritarian states like China and Russia have tended to define themselves by what they do not want to hear from their citizens. But the only way to achieve workable well-being and long-range political anti-fragility is to adapt our systems to what citizens would like to say, whether they know how to do so or not. Right now, our categories are wrong. Our interventions are crude. Our data is clumsy, misinterpreted, and unprotected. We significantly lack the tools by which to know ourselves and each other better, while increasing personal autonomy, collective security, and dynamic integrative novelty. And if I leave out any of those 5 things, then my solid hand-polished mahogany utopia will topple right in the goddamn middle of dinner. Knowing ourselves, knowing each other, increasing autonomy, increasing shared security, and increasing probably benevolent novelty. We are entering an era of unprecedented dangers. If you have good reason to think we should scale back on military and police, then you damned well better have an equally good idea about how to deal with 3D printed guns that aren't scannable at airports, homemade biotoxins, untracked nuclear weapons, terrorists, sociopaths, irrational hordes of fanatical mutant lobstermen rapaciously clattering around the bedrooms of your favorite daughters, etc. These are not merely reactionary conservative talking points, even if that's mostly how you've heard about them. These are real and growing dangers in addition to climate change and economic injustice. But on the other hand, if you take those threats seriously, you sure as Hades better make sure your plan isn't just to mass surveil all citizens, shout moralistic slogans at them, disappear people off the streets, uselessly torture them in camps, and release them back into the wild as high-spreading vectors of the trauma pandemic. Push harder is not a solution. And unless you are attempting to maximize safety and individual liberty simultaneously, then you will get neither. If you become an expert in self-knowledge, what good is that if you're still a prick to everyone else? And if you're an expert on mutuality and the needs of your fellow human beings, how will you still make sure your own needs are getting met and that your own system is evolving to higher and deeper levels of capacity and insight? So in Kaleva, we have what I call the MIPCIV, the Massive Internal Profiling Civilization. That worries people who are so uninformed as to think that they are not already being profiled in extraordinarily dumb ways that do not benefit them or their society. Kaleva did not go from freedom and privacy to mass internal profiling. We went from mass dumb external profiling to multi-dimensional individually owned evolving profiles of the content of your character, just like Martin Luther King said we should. So we named it after him. We introduced the MLK 9000. It was an individualized browser and search engine guaranteed by the state, the city, the civium, the whatever, originally to give each citizen secure control over their own medical histories, and to act as an interface for receiving necessary social benefits. This was the first move. Private or public groups using your medical history without your consent could be punished by criminal and civil law and made to suck the eggs at the bottom of an anthill while you get to rummage in their pockets. And to secure that data, you have your own digital platform with its own uniquely encrypted signature. No longer do you have to cling onto Google or Facebook, subordinating your private searches to their algorithms which serve their clients who are not you. And once you have the MLK 9000 installed, you can opt in to exert more control over your browsing and search history data, which belongs just to you, my sweet libertarian householder. No longer can tech giants as easily steal your information and sell it to advertisers to become the largest corporation since pharaonic Egypt. Now they have to get your permissions and give you a cut. And it's gotta be a fair deal. That's the American way. Your attention and your patterns belong to you. These systems, of course, were not perfect when we first rolled them out, but they improved with time. Just like our zero waste legislation in cities. We failed at that for years, but we finally had a target to meet and a principle to work on. The MLK 9000 turned out to be a better user of the internet than any human ever was. Today, the citizens of Kaleva can barely comprehend how limiting it would be to have to consciously think of a search item, phrase it verbally to themselves, hope they got it right, type it with their fingers, make sense of the results, and have all of that sold behind their back to some advertising company. How can consciousness, eyes, and fingers possibly keep up with the possibilities of the internet? How many of the websites you would most like to visit will you never hear about? How many possible deals and opportunities slip past you because it never even occurred to you to look for them, or because your searches are clumsy, frustrating, and channeled into corporate or politicized cul-de-sacs? How many government programs could help your family if only you knew about them and could auto-apply? Hell, you haven't even heard yet of the shows that would be your favorite shows if you ever got into them, which you probably won't. You aren't up 24 hours a day. You can't even remember what you thought of last week that you might want to search for. You are not the user of the internet. That is a lie. Thank God Almighty the MLK 9000 does it for us now. It uses your data to search for what someone like you might want for the internet in their circumstances and adjusts itself based on how satisfying you find those search returns to be. It's a kind of perfect secretary using your physical data, which is added to through all your biometric devices, which you get to choose to use or not, and through your psychological data through your search history and the responses to things you encounter. It scans the profiles of people similar to yourself who have voluntarily shared parts of their profiles, and it harvests on your behalf answers that you give to ever-evolving multi-intelligence profiling questions that it periodically prompts you to briefly engage with, and those questions are fun to answer. Kaleva. Rather than just trying to evaluate your IQ or dating compatibility or purchasing habits, the MLK 9000 does it all. This is what Ken Wilber's integral psychograph only hinted at. Tracking your developmental complexity along kinesthetic, moral, aesthetic, computational, linguistic, musical, social, spiritual, affective, etc. intelligences in a broad range of styles, constantly being tinkered with and improved by advanced psychological experts working in smart groups with AI assistants. Your profile has many dimensions and is constantly evolving. You are never trapped in someone else's definition of you. And once you opt into allowing your brain scan data for massively proliferating inexpensive portable brain scan devices, which make everyone into amateur yogis, then the whole process leaps forward exponentially. Why? Because honestly, how good is your conscious mind and working memory at knowing how you really feel about things? Maybe you don't want to know. It's opt-in, of course. But all your friends tell you how much better their life choices have become since they started including rich brain scan data into their profiles. Especially the ones who didn't know they were living with trauma. And sharing this information or part thereof is entirely up to you. But other people don't have to let you use their things if you don't. It's a free exchange. I run a goddamned aerospace company, Pascal Aerospace, and I don't want anyone on board who meets the general profile of the kind of terrorist who kills members of the public. I used to have a thumb-sucking dummy of an airport that just made people take off their shoes and x-ray their luggage, as if the problem was that objects were bad. Objects are neutral. I don't care if the air marshal has a gun on board. I trust that his internal profile indicates that he is probably stable, benevolent, and skilled. But I don't want a terrorist profile having a nail clipper, toothpick, or bottle of unknown fluid. The danger is in the profile, not in the objects, whether they be pocket knives, nose rings, or hajigs. And the more you share, the less you need to be hassled. At social checkpoints like borders and like airports. In exchange for getting on one of my airplanes, you share pertinent aspects of your profile, but it's totally up to you. And if people score as emotionally explosive dogmatists, they can simply work on that until that part of their profile resembles a much lower danger group. Think how much better that is than having half-trained jackasses in mall cop uniforms rough you up because you happen to be wearing a turban or have brown skin or be named Habib. The shift from external to internal profiling was liberating for the people of Kaleva. It decreased oppression, increased individual rights, and made society safer. Even made society run better, according to a law that people running for public office, the definition of which includes prominent board positions at major corporations, have to make their cognitive, emotional, social, and moral scores public, so that we know what kind of people wish to have a greater than normal share over public resources. Kaleva Mipsim. Well, what else would the readers of Women's Home Quarterly like to know about Kaleva while they're picking up tips on how to crimp the edges of that perfect bumbleberry pie? Do they want to hear about the depth of fellowship, the profundity of our marriages, the technological productivity of our citizens, the top-notch integrated healthcare and unparalleled quality of our conversations? How about our elections? We have big votes for everyone and lots of little votes for whoever wants them. Every child registered to vote automatically when they pass their mandatory post-high school service in the medical or military training, where they learn discipline, teamwork, and survival skills to look after the bodies of their fellow citizens. Voting holidays gamify the election and votes can be powered up. Every person guaranteed one vote, but if you do the mere minimum cognitive test to demonstrate you can identify the candidates and their stated positions, then your vote may well count as 5 votes. Olympic medal winners and public heroes get temporary bonuses like keys to the city in their voting. Members of the legislature get a voting bonus as long as they are in office, but any citizen can participate in a legislative vote. We have secret ballot in the general election and secret ballot in the legislature, so that your financial sponsors and political teams cannot hold you to account after you vote your conscience. Voting is done on a gradient from 1 to 10, because the election should be at least as smart as the goddamn focus group for Kellogg's cornflakes. Ranked choice runoffs and averaged outcomes replace pluralities and simple majorities. Members of the legislature are not entitled to any benefits that do not apply to all citizens. That means no government health care for them unless everyone gets it. Because unless you have skin in the game, you literally cannot make good decisions. Again, the point here is not to build Kaleva from these proposals, but to remember that your utopia has to take its collective decision procedures seriously and make sure its ideals are not squandered through the use of the same majoritarian show of hands among major shareholders that limit the complexity of the outcomes of decisions made normally at the abstract scales of nations and corporations. Smarter principles of group decision-making are everywhere in our utopia. One common pastime in Kaleva is to start a smart group. You don't even have to know what it's a group for, because the group decision, if it's done right, will be smarter about what the group should be about than would be the decision of even the smartest member of the group. Wouldn't it be great if you could actually trust groups to be as smarter than you about the things you care about? Think of the rational patriotism that would inculcate. Kaleva is multi-epistemic. This is the COSPAL principle. Cultural operating systems as pals or allies. Kaleva has all the main themes or cultural codes or stages working together without having to first agree on values or worldviews, but with the pervasive possibility of more coherent alignment along the continuity axis of historically emergent types of worldviews. What sorts of schools, you wonder, do we have in Kaleva? What sorts of biosphere projects are underway? What results are we getting from our self-developmental methodologies? What is our unifying aesthetic? How do we manage the diversity of experimental territorial land control by various thematic groups within society? And have we spread our seed communities to other planets? You're goddamn right we have. Kaleva has spread off-world because our psychosocial-biospheres are as applicable to orbits and Marses as they are to lands and seas. One planet, they say, is surely a sitting duck for black swans. So we certainly cannot afford to bury our heads in the sand like the proverbial ostrich, and I will eat crow if that isn't the case. Friends, the Kaleva that I remember is long gone. But like the Christ who died and was reborn many times in the multiverse, we may see its distributed flowering in all directions tomorrow and the day after, in the degree to which we are willing to risk the effort of thinking through how a meaningful, productive, full-spectrum civilization of intuitive beingness might work and work better. In the degree to which we are willing to risk supporting and experimenting with a variety of seed communities, while also trying to clarify and gamble on the principles of broader social change. Now, who's with me? Asked the president of the new republic, absent-mindedly picking at a fluorescent semen stain on the trousers of his half-rate Italian business suit. The responsibility, my fellow citizens, is yours. And if you're willing to do what anyone and everyone ought to do, then grab a shovel and meet me out behind the barn at 4 minutes to midnight, and we will get this show on the road. And if you do not know where the barn is, write your question in blood on a small strip of withered parchment paper and bury it deep in your backyard. One of our underground agents will contact you shortly. Or at least they would, in an ideal world.